I am Michael Flam, Chair of the History Department, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight to the annual Smith Lecture. I want to let you all know that tonight is not only the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, this is also the 65th anniversary of the arrival of Richard Dick Smith on this campus. Dick remains an inspiration to all of us. He remains an active, engaged scholar who recently published a distinguished work on Bishop McIlvaine, and I'm sure he'd be delighted to tell you how you can order this book and get your own copy after tonight's presentation. But we are honored to be here with Dick and with his wonderful wife, Betty, and with many of his former students, 18 of whom went on to get Ph.D.s in history, which is an extraordinary record. So this evening really is a tribute to and in honor of Dick Smith. And now it is my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce my colleague, Dr. Barbara Turgeon, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
I want to second Mike's comments about Dick and Betty Smith's fantastic contribution to the students who not only Dick had in his classroom, but who went through their homes. And of course, Dick is famous for, as those students will attest to this day, having meals with them when the silverware became the movement of regiments and companies. Move by the right flank, move by the right flank, move by the right flank. But Dick was so inspiring that we are also grateful to his former students for having generously endowed this lecture series. So we thank them as well. As you know, we've been tracking the 150th anniversary of the Civil War through these past years. And so this year we are very pleased to have Professor Carmichael here with us to talk about those final battles leading to Lee's surrender, and then to touch on what happened after that. Professor Carmichael is a professor at Gettysburg College, where he is the Robert C. Fleur Professor of Civil War Studies in the History Department. But more than that, he is the director of the very famous Gettysburg Institute. And as the director of that institute, one of the things that he does, which is quite remarkable, is to oversee every year a fantastic summer annual event that brings the public, teachers of Civil War, and leading historians into a week-long, or it could be a long weekend, discussion of something particular about the Civil War. So the Institute has been tracking the Civil War as well, and so those of you who are real Civil War history buffs, I highly recommend that you look into it. What better place to vacation than Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? In part, it's not just meeting leading historians who are going to give you the cutting-edge scholarly production on particular issues, but you also get private battlefield tours. You have private time to talk with them. So I myself am thinking about going this year, so if you want to join me, let me know. More about Professor Carmichael, though. I am very impressed with the breadth of his Civil War scholarship, because a lot of it is military history, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But he also has studied race and gender issues. So, for example, contributing about the history of slavery in the Civil War and Reconstruction, a gender study of, quote-unquote, military marriages. So I was very interested to see that. Not only is it military history, but it's the new history where you take into more account than just simply what's happening on the battlefields. But as to that, I don't think there is a single major campaign in the Eastern Theater that he hasn't written about. So let's see. Shenandoah Campaign of 1862, check. 7 Days Battle, 62, check. Antietam, check. The Confederate artillery at Gettysburg for Pickett's charge. We're going to hear more about that tomorrow in my class. Wilderness campaign, Spotsylvania, check, check. And so tonight, then, it makes perfect sense for us to hear from him about the final battles of 1865. So please join me in welcoming Professor Carmichael tonight. We're very pleased to have him.
Is that green? Yes. Okay, good, thank you. Barbara, no, you're big. Thank you so much, Barbara, for that lovely invitation. And we need to hire you for our marketing at CWI Summer Conference. You said it better than what I've ever said it. It is.
I'm planning on getting a discount.
You will get a discount. If I had little cards, I could have passed them out, and we could have given a special discount to all the folks here at Ohio Wesleyan. You all have been so wonderful and so gracious here. I am a native Hoosier. I'm from Indiana. And, of course, yes, we have a few Hoosiers I know out there. And living on the East Coast, well, there's a lot of snobbery, as you know, that occurs on the East Coast toward us Midwesterners. And one is about our landscape, which they, of course, describe as being monotonous and dull. And I keep telling them that, in fact, when you get out into the Midwest, you can actually see, right? You can take in the land. There's nothing more beautiful than flat lands and cornfields. So coming back here to Ohio today feels good. Feels really good to come back to Ohio, and especially to come to a campus at Ohio Wesleyan that's very much like the school where I teach now at Gettysburg College. I did my undergraduate training and my graduate training, and I've taught at 3 other institutions. I wasn't fired from any of those schools. I've left on my own. All those schools, though, were public institutions, and of course we all believe in the mission of public education. But there's something special about being at a small liberal arts institution. And of course, I am immediately struck by Dr. Smith's connection, his relationship with his former students. And those of you who are educators here, those of you who want to become educators, of course, we all aspire that we will ultimately have this profound impact on the people that we touch in the classroom. And we know that at a small liberal arts institution, that you have the opportunity to actually get outside the classroom and continue these very valuable conversations that shape the lives of your students for years to come. And so when I was watching Dr. Smith in action and meeting his former students, I can only say that if my career ends like what you have right now, I've had a successful career. So Dr. Smith, you are a real treasure here at Ohio Wesleyan. And what is really amazing to me, has he lost any passion for this school at all? Look, I'm almost certain that if the president came to you and said, Dick, we need a mascot for the football game, would you do that for us? He'd do it, wouldn't he? There's no doubt in my mind. So, when somebody says, I don't really have a big ego, like immediately the alarm bells go off, right? You're like, yep, of course. So I'm going to start this talk in a way that's incredibly self-indulgent. And it begins with this photograph, which is me. Which I hope all of you made that connection. I know it's a little fuzzy, but that's me in 1985. In 1985, when I portrayed a Union soldier at Appomattox, his name was Corporal Billy Fields. Corporal Billy Fields had to pretend that it was 1865 every day. So when visitors came to me and they wanted to talk to me about God knows what, King's Dominion down the road, I had to just pretend that King's Dominion didn't exist. Now, of course, this led to all kinds of awkward and uncomfortable situations. It also led to some very interesting and really powerful educational moments. First person can allow that unique experience to occur. And I'll speak about that in just a moment. But there was lots of curious things that occurred during the summer as well. Again, although I was from Indiana, for whatever reason, I had this infatuation with the Confederacy, and I was very much a product of what's called the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause, as you know, is this romantic interpretation of Confederate and Southern history. I didn't think slavery had anything to do with the cause of the war. I thought Abraham Lincoln was basically a cynical politician. who was out for himself. I thought that ultimately the war was won because of sheer numbers on the northern side, and that the very best generals resided in the Confederacy. So I had all of that baggage that I took to this very first job. Again, I was 19 years old, and during the course of the summer, I was called Damn Yankee day in and day out, not just by Southerners, but by a range of folks. And at first it was kind of, in jest and back and forth. But after a while, my patience started to wear. It was ridiculously hot, wearing that hot uniform. Of course, you've heard it before, but it's true. Sweat's streaming down your face, you're in wool, and someone will come up and say, "Is it hot?" And I want to say, "Here's the butt of my musket. If I hit it against your head, will it hurt?" Of course. I restrained, thankfully. And what really struck me, though, was the anger, the bitterness that some people had toward Ulysses S. Grant. So here we are at this place where some people would argue that the nation came back together. We'll need to talk about that as a group. But nonetheless, here is this moment in which Ulysses S. Grant, a moment in which he was extraordinarily gracious, in which he extended peace terms, surrender terms, not peace terms, surrender terms to Lee that were, as I said before, they were generous, right? They brought this war, for all practical purposes, to a close. But for whatever reason, people, they could not embrace Grant as a hero. And obviously, I'm not the brightest guy in the room, but it took all of this for me to suddenly say, what's going on here? Why is it that so many Americans have such a difficult time embracing Ulysses S. Grant as a hero? And what they want to do is talk about the virtues of the poor Southern soldier who was without shoes and desperately hungry and just trying to fight and defend his home. And then Robert E. Lee, he is a man of virtue. He is the perfect Southern gentleman. Contrary to Grant, he's what? You all can say it right now. We can have a little conversation. How do you think most people describe Grant? Just yell it out. What? Drunk, butcher, those are the two things that are right at the top of the list. It's nothing but a drunk and a butcher. My freshman paper at IUPUI, I remember I did a comparison of Grant and Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, and the very opening paragraph looked at their physical presentation. And there's Lee in his dress uniform with a sword that was given to him by the people of Maryland. And Grant, in contrast, he had a simple private's coat on with, of course, his Major General insignia on his shoulders. But he was what? Spattered with mud, right? He was sloppy. And therein, I saw the distinct differences, not just between those two men, but between what? Those two societies. It's so horrible, such flawed thinking. It's just embarrassing to even revisit those days. But here is the issue that we all have to come back to. Why, in fact, do so many Americans, even today, do they embrace that image of R.E. Lee as not a traitor, but as a true American hero who embodied the very best of American values? It is not our attempt, I hope, tonight to savage Lee's historical reputation and his character. There certainly were personal virtues about Lee. He was a slaveholder that's utterly indefensible. But I think we need to revisit that later. Why Lee has such a hold on the American imagination and why Grant does not. Let me give you a few other big questions that we're going to talk about as we get into my presentation. The other questions that I received as Corporal Bobby Fields, why did the North win, or why did the South lose? Those are two separate questions, but as we puzzle through my talk, which will be mostly a narrative, and I'll provide some analysis, I'm hoping at the end we can come up with some of our own interpretations. Why did the North win? Why did the South lose? Good? The other big question. Did the events at Appomattox, which triggered the defeat of other Confederate armies, or I should say surrender of other Confederate armies, did it bring a true revolution to this country? Or in fact, did the war essentially change nothing at all? That what we have or had in the South in the post-war period was the emergence of second slavery. Those are the things we're going to contemplate. Those are the things we're going to think about. Dick made some excellent remarks at dinner. I think they're very much in alignment with Dick's observations. These are big, powerful, important questions that resonate and have great relevance to us today. Apologize for the sniffing. I have terrible allergies, and so I'll be battling this. Oh, let me just one other last thing. So doing first-person interpretation is, again, it's quite a treat because you get visitors who, they feel absolutely uninhibited. So I worked with a guy who was so into playing his character. I wasn't. I would break character. I'm just going to come clean here. We're all friends. And keep in mind, I'm an 18-year-old kid. No, excuse me, 19-year-old kid. And if there were young women around my age, I broke character. I broke character every time. Give me a break here. I'm living in Appomattox Courthouse. I mean, it's pretty desolate. I broke character one too many times. I broke character with a young woman from Philadelphia. 6 years later, I happened to marry her. And then 6 years after that, we got divorced. Yeah, so I mean, that's revealing a little bit too much, but there is a good lesson here, especially for our young historians. If you're doing first person, don't what? Don't break character. The history gods smacked me down, didn't they? So my buddy Mark was so into this. He had big, bushy sideburns, yes? Huge, mutton chops. Of course, he had no interest in ever getting a date, right? Like, if you're going to look like that, it's going to be tough getting a date. But he had these big mutton chops. A visitor walked up to him, pulled on his mutton chops, pulled on him and said, "Is that real?" I was the rudest thing to ever seen. Mark said, I remember he said, "Stop pulling on my face." It was awful. But then Mark, of course, in his zeal to keep it real, right? An elderly woman came to, we were in front of what's called the tavern, and she said, I need to get a drink of water. All Mark had to say was, "Ma'am, just walk through the tavern. There's a bathroom back there and a drinking fountain." But no, Mark had to keep it real. He said, "Ma'am, Mr. McLean has a well in his front yard, and I think he'd be happy to give you some water." She said, "Thank you." She then walked across the village, Virginia summer heat, got to the well, and the well, of course, is it's an audio station. You push a button to listen to about the surrender. And then she then made her way back over to the tavern. She went into the bookstore, and we heard her say, "That damn Yankee." It was awesome. Okay, that was a lot. We're doing our time. Okay, let's get to 1865. And at the very end, let me step back a little bit from that. When Confederate armies capitulate in the spring of 1865, this was something that many observers thought was absolutely impossible. They thought it was impossible because the Confederacy itself, it was so expansive that it could never physically be conquered. It, in fact, constituted more than 500,000 square miles. That excludes Florida and Texas, I might add. 500,000 square miles. But in fact, Union forces did what? They actually penetrated that massive land body. And in fact, occupying or penetrating that Confederate-held territory, Union forces destroyed, ready? 2/3 of the assessed value of Southern wealth, 2/5 of the South's livestock, 1/4 of white men between ages of 20 and 40. 1/4. You can put to rest any notion that this was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Everybody, and I mean everybody, they got into the mix. You couldn't avoid it. More than half of the farm machinery was ruined, and damage to railroads and industries, you just couldn't calculate it. Total northern wealth, on the other hand, at the end of the war, increased by 50% from 1860 to 1870. Southern wealth, on the other hand, decreased by 60%. Rampaging Union armies brought the hard hand of war. To the south, you had, I think, a discussion or conversation about that last year with Mark Grimsley from Ohio State University. And so get my best with this. Excellent. And as we all know, William Tecumseh Sherman is often given the credit to being the architect for this hard war policy. I think that's a little simple. Mark probably explained to you that many of those hard war tactics, taking war to the civilians, happened on the ground level of war, happened with the soldiers themselves. William Tecumseh Sherman, as you also know, he unleashed hard war in a way that was more thorough and more comprehensive than anywhere else in the South when he embarked upon his march through Georgia. He captured the city of Atlanta in late summer of 1864. After that, he occupied Atlanta, wasn't really certain what to do next, but he then embarked upon that march to the sea in which he met almost no resistance until he came to Savannah, Georgia around Christmas of 1864. That campaign, it said to Lincoln, it said to Sherman, it said to Grant, it said to the men at the ground that taking the war to the logistical base, to the South's ability to be able to move and ship and transport uniforms, equipment, and food, that was going to do more damage to Southern armies than any battle. All right, so there's some problems, though. And what's really amazing is that that the North was able to conquer that much territory because there were some decisive advantages that the Confederates had. I'm going to step down here for a moment. All right. Those decisive advantages are often forgotten, and they're almost always forgotten when we talk about the lost cause, which posits that Confederate armies were simply what? They were overwhelmed by superior Union forces. Now, what's overlooked is that the power of the defense, which most Confederate armies assumed throughout the war, the power of the defense was a tremendous advantage because, and this gets you right on the ground level of war, the muskets that Civil War soldiers used could kill a man 500 yards away. That rarely happened during the Civil War because hills, rocks, and trees got in the way. So most Civil War fighting was at fairly close range, 200 yards or less. But the bayonet, which you associate with hand-to-hand fighting, rarely happened in the Civil War. It's a possibility, right? You can kill a man 200 yards away, and that gun that you're firing, you can shoot 3 times a minute. That's a tremendous volume of firepower. And that tremendous volume of firepower, if you're standing and people are coming at you, like this audience, you can imagine, and I should add, they are coming toward me in dense ranks, not quite this dense, but very similar to how you all are sitting. So for someone on the defense, they don't have to single out a man, do they? All they have to do is to point at a thick body of troops, and the casualties, as we all know, were absolutely frightening. Absolutely frightening. Power of the defense, Confederacy enjoyed that. The second thing, which is almost always overlooked, Civil War armies were virtually indestructible. Virtually indestructible. You can point to battle after battle in which the victorious side took the field, but the defeated side was able to what? Retreat, keep its army basically intact, and in short order, they were able to fight again. Those who look at the Civil War, even seriously, they often imagine, and this is a real problem if you study Civil War history, is to read accounts and then to look at maps and to say, if they would have done this, if they just would have moved here, they would have been able to capture, destroy, and here's the best word, annihilate the enemy. That just simply wasn't possible. Civil War officers came to that conclusion very quickly, especially Union officers. And here's a good example. After William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta, the Confederate Army under John Bell Hood, it in essence retreated to the west, moved into Alabama, and Sherman said to Grant, let's not play their game. And their game would have been to chase that Confederate Army around, to get into that Confederate Army from time to time, have a pitched battle, and then what would have happened after that? Pitched battle, Army, Confederate Army, even if it was defeated, it wouldn't have really been defeated. It simply would have gone off, licked its wounds, and fought another day. And these are some very formidable, serious, almost impossible advantages that the Confederates had. And of course, you rarely ever hear of that. Some other advantages that the Confederacy had. If, in fact, Union armies were successful, and we know they were, and as they penetrated deeper and deeper into the Confederacy, the deeper they got, the more perilous their situation became. Because their supply lines became what? Extended, right? They become extraordinarily vulnerable. Whereas the Confederates, as they're retreating, they become what? They actually become stronger. Grant complained about this time and time again. So even in a situation in which you've achieved something on the field, to continue to pursue that defeated enemy from the Federal or Union perspective actually made your army more vulnerable. So good God, how did these guys pull it off? Because right now, it appears that the odds are stacked against them. Is a war of annihilation going to win? Excuse me, it's not annihilation that I'm trying to use here. It is a war in which Grant is simply saying, I've got the numbers on my side, and I'm going to do what? Attack, attack, attack. That's of course, the butcher Grant. That's a war of attrition. That going to win this war? Absolutely not. Not only is it politically suicide, as we saw in 1864, it almost doomed Lincoln's presidency because of the battlefield failures and high casualties. Right? But above all else, a war of attrition isn't going to annihilate the enemy. Hey, I'm going to call on you all again. Give me some examples in which a Civil War army was completely destroyed. There's only a few. So at the very end of the war, 1864, John Bell Hood's army is destroyed. You all talked about that, I assume, last year. And that's because what did John Bell Hood do? He bludgeoned his army against the Union forces. Okay, there's one. Keep going. What's that? Nope, they're not destroyed. That's a good example, though. I'm glad you pointed it out. Manassas, the troops are routed, but they do what? The Federal forces retreat back to the Washington defenses, and they're ready to fight again another day. The other ones, and they're all, of course, Ulysses S. Grant, or thanks to Ulysses S. Grant. We have Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in 1862. The Confederates are captured. And then we also have Vicksburg in July of 1863. And then finally, we have, which we will eventually get to, I promise, even though I'm only on slide 2, which makes me a little nervous right now. We also have Appomattox. Appomattox. So there are 3 total or complete victories. Grant gets all of them. Grant gets all of them. Good? But still, annihilation is very, very difficult. So let's go to the other issue about what's called interior lines that the Confederates were able to take advantage of. Remember, as they retreat, they get stronger, and they're then allowed, or they're able to draw from a railroad network where they have the shortest distance to move troops and equipment. Interior lines. Confederates enjoyed it throughout the entire war. So how do we go about this? Well, Grant and Lincoln have the answer. And if you're taking notes, this is something to write down because most people, even serious students of the Civil War, don't think about it on these terms. They often think that it's a war of attrition. They're absolutely wrong. That's not what happened. What Grant and Lincoln came up with, first, simultaneous advances. Simultaneous advances. That is crucial. That started in 1864, in which Grant, as General-in-Chief, he has command of all the Union Army, all the Union forces. Where did he make his headquarters, though? Class? He made his headquarters with? What army, though? Army of the Potomac, right? That's the army in Virginia, correct? But he took all the other armies, and they moved at the same time. Lincoln was always frustrated with his generals because he saw that there was a lack of coordination. That they, in fact, one army would move in Virginia, would get repulsed or knocked back, and then another Union army would move somewhere in Tennessee. And what were the Confederates able to do? They were able to shift troops through interior lines to meet these different hotspots. So Grant came in, and of course with Lincoln's blessing, and said, we are going to do simultaneous advances. 64, that's the beginning of it. It meets with mixed results, but nonetheless, it pinned the Confederates down. They couldn't shift these troops as they had once done. Second part. And again, this stuff isn't the sexy stuff. It's not interesting. It doesn't capture the romance of the battlefield. And that's what Civil War enthusiasts want to read about. But what they really should be reading about is, here's the second part, a raiding strategy. A raiding strategy. It's a raiding strategy directed toward lines of communication and supply lines. And so that's the essence of the hard war strategy that you all talked about last year. We know our man here, William Tecumseh Sherman, who is, by anyone's, I think, definition, a true intellectual. If you ever get an opportunity, read his letters. They've all been published. They are truly brilliant and well worth your time. Okay. We'll begin with Sherman here, who from Savannah, as you see at the where is Savannah there? There's Beaufort. I don't see Savannah anywhere, right? Up, there you go, right at the very bottom. You all see that? Okay, there's Savannah. He captured it in December of 1864. In January of 65, he begins his march through the interior of South Carolina and North Carolina. The thing that should stand out to you is not these blue lines that are moving all over the place, but, boy, these nice little railroads. And, of course, that's what Sherman has set his eyes on. He is going to snip those railroads because he knew that by snipping those railroads, he was doing just as much damage to R.E. Lee's army, as if he were within the sounds of the artillery of Lee's artillery. In other words, he's doing more here than actually fighting and engaging Lee's army face to face. And as Sherman's men made their way into South Carolina, they unleashed, and I mean unleashed, their anger, and you can probably understand why. They saw South Carolina as, it's the hotbed, it is the epicenter of secession. The epicenter of secession. Now, in Georgia, as I suspect Mark probably told you, there was a fair amount of restraint, They almost never burned civilian homes. That almost never happened. And those of you who are dog lovers, put your hands over your ears right now. I'm a dog lover myself. The one thing that never escaped the wrath of Sherman's men, supposedly during the march in Georgia, were dogs. They killed almost every dog they saw. And that seems, well, how in the world would they do that? Why would they do that? Any ideas? Nice. Used to hunt slaves, and the second part, used to hunt down Union prisoners as well who had run away. So they shot down almost every. Now, they got into South Carolina, and they pretty much lost all sense of restraint. They especially directed their wrath against the prominent Southerners or South Carolinians in the area, and then they got all the way up to Columbia, the capital of the state. And when they got into Columbia, there's a lot of controversy as to what happened. Certainly, there were fires that were set. Sherman's men said that the Confederate cavalry did it as they abandoned the town. I suspect that if, in fact, that did happen, I don't believe that Sherman's men were also eager to try to put out the flames. So you have the burning and destruction of Columbia. That occurred, I should have the date right in front of me, and I apologize that I don't. That occurred on February 17th, the very same day that Charleston surrendered. And we're going to talk a little bit about this at the very end of the talk. Entering Charleston, South Carolina, African-American troops singing John Brown's Body. Ooh, that's rubbing salt in the wound there, isn't it? Huh? So you have Charleston, and you have, where is Columbia? It's not there. It's somewhere. It's in here. There it is. There's Columbia. And we have, there's the burning of Columbia. Again, there's much controversy even to this day. No one's going to settle it. Look, I suspect that there were plenty of people on both sides who are at fault here. But what you need to appreciate and understand, at least from my perspective, that this burning, and we can certainly lament it and think that it's unnecessary, but I think we also need to appreciate that for these Union soldiers, it certainly was an act of vengeance, but there's a political side to this. They had lost so many comrades. They'd been pulled from their homes. They had endured all this suffering. And my God, it's these people, this planter class, this haughty planter class in South Carolina, that they had pushed their state and other southern states out of the Union. And by God, we're going to make absolutely certain that this isn't going to happen again. And there you have one of many, many powerful photographs of the ruins, not just of Charleston, but also, that's of course, of Columbia. And take a look at it. A friend of mine who teaches down in Florida, he's done a brilliant analysis as to how Northerners back on the home front, how they took in these photographs. What don't you see? No people, right? And if you're a Northern civilian and you look at these ruins and you think to yourself, my God, look at the might and the power of our armies, the strength of our men, the bravery of our generals. We have absolutely vanquished that place. Destroyed it. It's truly in ruins. Now, I think what many Northerners failed to appreciate is what those buildings looked like before the destruction. Because if they had imagined what those ruins looked like before they became ruins, it would have been a reminder to them of the power, the wealth, the prestige of that South Carolina slave-holding class. We don't see any people there, but we all know what happened after 1865. That those buildings were rebuilt, and many of those very same people of that slaveholding class, they came into power in a new guise. It certainly shocked and caught Northerners off guard because they believed, of course, you had the physical evidence of our dominance and of our complete victory. But as we know, pictures are a little misleading, aren't they? We like to believe as historians, hey, we've got truth here, don't we? This tells us something. It doesn't. I mean, it does tell us something, but we start to get into confusing ways in which people interpret visual culture like this. All right. From Columbia, Sherman's forces, I'm going to show you another map. Oops, that wasn't the one I was hoping to see. Oh, no. There we go. Sherman's forces continue to make their march up into North Carolina. In North Carolina, there's a battle of Bentonville. It is an attempt by Joseph E. Johnston. Joseph E. Johnston, who had a very tense, that's really a mild way of describing his relationship with Jefferson Davis. He is brought back into command, and this is going to shock everyone. What's Joseph Johnston noted for? Class. Retreat, retreat, and retreat. That's what he did in 1862 outside Richmond. He retreated out. Everyone thought he was just going to hand over Richmond. And it appeared that he was going to do that until he was wounded, right? Taken from the field, and Lee came into command. He had this reputation, and I think deservedly so, for always sort of looking behind the lines. And he did that during the Atlanta campaign of 1864. But now we get to the Battle of Bentonville, which I've got the wrong thing here. And where is our little Bentonville? Is it right up here? It should be. Yeah, right in there someplace. And at Bentonville, he actually attacked. Even though he was badly outnumbered, I think he had less than 20,000 men. Sherman certainly had more than 50,000 men. He found an isolated column at Bentonville. He struck it. There's a 2.5-day battle. It was, I won't say inconclusive, because ultimately Johnston had to retreat, and he made his retreat back toward Greensboro. Now, we got to get out of sequence here just a little bit so we can finish this part of the story. Let me just sort of summarize what Sherman had done in his Carolina campaign. He had marched more than 425 miles in 50 days. 425 miles in 50 days. Again, it's very similar to the march through Georgia, but this march in South Carolina as well as in North Carolina, it tore the absolute guts out of Southern civilian morale. In fact, Joseph Johnston wrote to Jefferson Davis, and he basically said that the people, the civilians, they have given up. And so for anyone who says, I studied just the military history of the Civil War, that's extremely problematic. And here's a good example. These military operations and the outcome of these battles, they are crucial to trying to understand how Southern and Northern civilians, how they gauged their own prospects, and how they really saw their own loyalties to their respective causes. There is a pause after the Battle of Bentonville, and during that pause, while Sherman is collecting resources and his forces, on April 18th, this is again after Lee's surrender, which occurred on April 9th, so 9 days later. Because of Lee's surrender, Johnston then expresses his desire to surrender his forces. It happens at the Bennett Place. Let's not do that. There we go. There's the Bennett Place. There's where Sherman and Johnston met. I won't get you in details of the terms itself, but I will simply say this, that Sherman acted beyond his responsibility. He moved into the political realm, which he should not have done. He was slapped on the wrist by Grant, and he had to reconfigure those terms so that they were more in alignment with what Grant had proposed to Lee at Appomattox. The surrender at Greensboro, again, was in reaction to or a consequence of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. All right. Oh my, a lot of time here. All right, here's the siege lines around Petersburg and Richmond, and we'll get very quickly through this so we can get to Appomattox. This map is fairly easy to follow. You can see at Richmond, northern part of your map, Confederate lines, trench lines, many of them in fact existing or standing today. They ventured south across the James River, then crossed the Appomattox River, and then they curled around the city of Petersburg. I mentioned to you before the importance of railroads, and all you have to do is see that these two cities, they are tethered together, and that Richmond's survival depended upon the protection of Petersburg. because as you can see, there is one railroad that's clearly in Union hands, a second railroad headed to the south where they would get supplies, also in Union hands, a third railroad, the Weldon Railroad, and then by the spring of 1865, there is one last lifeline, and that is the famed South Side Railroad. So, when the campaign began in 1865, Lee was barely holding on. His troops simply didn't have enough men to man this position. His hope was to, in fact, escape these trenches and to venture down and to link up with Joseph E. Johnston. He was unable to do that because in March, Union operations took hold. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I want to show you first, this is a picture. It's not as clear as I was hoping that it would be. It is a photograph that's taken from a signal station on the Union lines. And what's useful and important about this is that you can get a sense of the no man's land that existed between Union and Confederate lines outside Petersburg and Richmond as well. So for those of you who have studied World War I, this looks a lot like the battlefields there, but with one profound difference. You're not going to find any craters in the ground there at all. The ordnance, the power of that ordnance in World War I absolutely dominated, controlled the battlefield. That didn't occur here. It certainly was lethal, but not in the same force that it was during World War I. The other thing that I want you to remember, or to imagine, is that in the spring of 1865, Lee's army is hemorrhaging deserters. Every day, especially in February and March, he is losing thousands of men, and those men, of course, are heading out from the Confederate lines, which are where that wood line is there. So they have to scurry across this open field, and the men that they had to worry about the most were not Union pickets, but that's right, their own. They had to worry about their own soldiers. Pickets were instructed to shoot at their comrades who were trying to desert. There was a man from North Carolina named Alexander Keever, obviously on the Confederate side. He reported to his wife that when he saw these men scurry across this no man's land, that many of his pickets who were, crack shots in battle, they suddenly lost their aim. They were shooting high and they were allowing these men to escape. And I just very quickly here want to give a quick anecdote about Alexander Keever. This soldier, he's poor, non-slaveholder, brought into the war in 1864. He is utterly miserable. His wife just berates him all the time for being in the army. Poor guy, what was he supposed to do? Did she not know there's a draft out there? And there was. And so they go back and forth, and he is calculating what should he do. Should he desert? At times he says, all I can do is turn and put my trust in Providence, and Providence will bring us out of this. And then there are other moments that he thinks that he has some control over his affairs and that he can secure his own safety. And right when he was about ready to desert, he got a care package from his brother. It had clothes, it had some food, and this is in about March of 1865. He wrote his wife real quickly and he said, I think I've got enough now to get to the end of the war. And the point of all of this is that this decision to desert, it certainly affected Confederate fortunes, but we have to remind ourselves the act of soldiering mattered. These are questions of pragmatism. These are questions of survival, not just for himself, but also for his wife. And so he gets this box. He says, heck, I don't need to desert because if I desert, you know what's going to happen to me? I got to make a long journey home. I got to make a long journey home, and when I come home, am I going to be able to stay home? Of course not. They're just not going to let him sit back there on the front porch and enjoy life just as it was before. There's going to be militia out there that's going to try to arrest him. He's going to have to go and hide out in the woods. And if he does get caught, he wrote to his wife that he would likely get shot. We have to remind ourselves time and time again, these constraints that come down on, these are practical constraints. Let's get one more in there and then we'll finish the rest of this campaign. And it is the constraint of honor and culture. What do you think I mean by that? The honor of culture. Excuse me. Yes, an honor culture. How is that a restraint? Honor culture. It's a part peer pressure. That's exactly right. So there is an expectation of comrades, and also we can't forget the home front and the women on the home front. There's an expectation that their men will do their duty. Now, in Keever's example, he's got his wife who's saying, leave, leave, leave. We're going to starve if you don't do it. But for most Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers, there is a culture of honor, which is a man's reputation. And a man's reputation is connected to his public behavior. And so that if you do desert, if you leave the ranks, you have disgraced yourself. And not just disgraced yourself, you've disgraced your family as well. And so when we go to a battlefield, I implore all of you to, of course, take in the monuments, look at the tactics, but bring in the social and cultural history, because when you do that, you can then move away from what I say are bedtime stories. We want bedtime stories in the Civil War. We want to go to the battlefields. We want to hear about great heroics. We want to hear about bravery. We want to hear about duty. All of that, of course, is true. But we also need to remind ourselves that these men, like all historical actors, like ourselves, that there are forces always impending upon people. Yes? All right. Oh, I keep getting these things wrong. By March of 65, Ulysses S. Grant was ready to launch his final strike against Petersburg. His aim was the South Side Railroad. Where are we? There's Five Forks. Okay, so there it is. South Side Railroad. See it? And where does it turn? There's his last lifeline. Okay? Grant has every intention of striking that. He has Union cavalry under, I hope this is the next slide. Yes. Phil Sheridan. Phil Sheridan from? Oh, come on. Ohio, that's right. I have to say, I love Ohio. I don't like Ohio State so much. I just have to get that out of my system. But I like Ohio. He's not really, I don't know, he's not one of your sons that I'd be beaming with pride about, right? I mean, he said some awful things and did some awful things after the war with Native Americans. He's attributed, at least, for saying the only good Indian is a dead Indian. He's very much a man of his time. What makes him really sort of unlikable is his overriding ambition that was almost always at the expense of others. But he did something that Grant badly needed. He was relentlessly aggressive and incredibly confident and absolutely impatient with people around him. He did not like inefficient officers. And he was crucial to this final campaign's operations. Go back to here. Okay, here we go. So here you see the Union Army, Union line moving to the south and then moving to the west. As you, again, I want to point out, snipping railroads, snip, snip, snip. Roads as well. Hey, there you have it. Strategy of exhaustion. All right, there you go. This is no war of attrition. Strategy of exhaustion. Now we got to get to the South Side Railroad. That is Grant's assignment to Sheridan and some infantry soldiers under Gouverneur K. Warren. I know you all have been to Gettysburg before, and when you've been to Gettysburg at Little Round Top, there is a monument to Gouverneur K. Warren. He is, of course, the hero or savior, called that at least, of Little Round Top. Gouverneur K. Warren was he was a persnickety man, tough to get along with, and he and Sheridan butted heads often, and they did here on an important battle on April the 1st, a place called Five Forks. The Confederates here were under another Gettysburg hero, George Pickett. George Pickett, who had, as you probably know, he had curls, and they weren't just curls, they were perfume curls. Nice, huh? And he had married during the war. He was 36 years old, I believe. He had married LaSalle Corbell, who was 16, going on 17. He was madly in love with her. He was absolutely, I mean, I guess this is somewhat romantic and heartwarming, unless you are serving under him. He would sneak away from his own company to go see her in Petersburg and Richmond. I mean, he was a very sloppy officer, and he, of course, he did not acquit himself very well here at Five Forks. And Five Forks is just what you would imagine. It's 5 roads coming together. And those 5 roads coming together are, come on, Pete, right. This is ridiculous. There is the Ford Road coming down. There it is. It says Five Forks. How about that? So there you have it. I'm not going to give you all the details of that except to say this. Where was George Pickett? Maybe many of you know. Where was George Pickett at Five Forks? Any guesses? Man, look at this, the shad bake. We got somebody who knows some Confederate history back here. He's all the way back there. He's having shad. Shad is considered to be a delicacy. It was a fish caught in the Nottoway River. There was undoubtedly some brandy that was there as well. So General Pickett and his staff and some other high-ranking Confederate officers, including Robert E. Lee's nephew. So you know what? If you're going to misbehave in the Army, this is smart, man. You get the commanding officer's nephew with you, right? I mean, it's like a free pass, right? I'm sure he must have thought that. So they're up there having a shad bake, and in the meantime, there's pretty much constant pressure delivered against Pickett's forces here. But late afternoon on April the 1st, Gouverneur K. Warren's infantry here, they launch a massive assault, and you can sort of tell by all the squiggly marks here, they overwhelm the Confederate line. Well, while George Pickett is cleaning his teeth with, the fish of a shad. He looked up and he saw one of his couriers get captured. which, of course, again, not the brightest guy in the world, but he saw that and thought, wait a minute, something must be wrong here. And so he hopped on his horse, and he rode all the way down to the Five Forks area, right there. Of course, his line had crumbled. He was yelling and screaming for people to save themselves. That's real inspiring, right? And they did to some degree. They made an orderly retreat, but the main point is that the consequence of this is not that or that, but that the South Side Railroad is now what? It's exposed, it's open, and Lee is informed of this. He recognizes that basically the game is up. So does Grant, and Grant for the next day, April the 2nd, he delivers massive assaults, final attacks along the Petersburg lines, and this is one consequence of it. These are very, very, very powerful images of Confederate dead on April the 2nd. God, I mean, just what, 7 more days and they had got through the war. One of the interesting side notes about these photographs is that the uniforms, again, it doesn't quite fit our imagination as to how Confederates were surviving at the very end of the war. They are pretty well equipped and clothed, and you'll never guess where these uniforms came from, but Ireland. They were made in Ireland. So there's a whole international dimension of the war that is beyond the scope of this talk, but we should again remind ourselves that these Confederate soldiers who we think, oh, they're just wearing homespun outfits made from home and they're barely getting by, certainly there was plenty of suffering. But these uniforms, they actually were made in parts in Ireland, and then those parts were sent to the South, and then women at various households would then sew them together. All right, you all, how are we doing on time here? Not good. I'm so sorry about this. I talked too much about Appomattox. See, I was so self-indulgent. Okay, I'm going to get this done in 5 minutes here. This, of course, is the evacuation of Richmond, Virginia. Jefferson Davis was informed of the fact that the city would have to be abandoned. And the crucial part of this in April the 2nd is time for Lee. Lee needs time above all else. He doesn't need men, he needs time. He needs time to be able to escape. Skipping that. And that. There we go. He needs time to be able to escape Richmond and Petersburg. And as you see, there is Richmond and Petersburg. Good. And look at the little lines that come out of there. There's roughly 5 columns that come out of Richmond and Petersburg. They begin that retreat on April the 3rd. As you can imagine, it's extraordinarily difficult to extract an army. And again, here's the thing that's always puzzled me. Why did they wait to this moment? Why did they wait until the Union Army dictated the terms of their retreat? If they were so bent on getting down to North Carolina and getting to Joseph Johnston, why not do it on your terms? I can't answer it. Hard fact of this, though, is that Lee, again, needs that time, and he gets to a place called Amelia Courthouse. There's Amelia Courthouse. You can see how all the red lines come together basically right here. Oops, there you go, yes. Amelia Courthouse, he was expecting to have rations there. He found none, just ammunition. And so he decided to halt for a day. Remember I said he needed time above all else? What did he just do in deciding to halt and to send foraging parties out? He lost all that time. And in losing all that time, and this is the crucial thing to understand about the Appomattox campaign, is Union armies, they're not going to just trail the Confederate forces. They're not going to just nip at the end of the column. What are they going to do here? Here's your raiding strategy to some degree. They are going to parallel or go to the south of the Confederates. Everyone got that? Yes? And so with that loss of time, now Phil Sheridan, the Union cavalry commander, is put in a position that he will ultimately be able to do what? But slip around to the front of Lee's army. During this, during this retreat, which was extraordinarily chaotic, and the reactions of the men were extraordinarily varied. Lots of desertion. Joseph Glatar, I would say one of the most esteemed historians to come out of Ohio Wesleyan. He's written incredible books, Sherman's Men and on Lee's soldiers. He discovered that Lee's men, the ration that they were receiving, simply didn't have enough calories to build muscle mass. These men were literally starving in the trenches of Petersburg. Now you get them out in the field, and they literally don't have the energy and the resolve. Men often straggled because they decided to straggle. But during the retreat, during Appomattox, many of these men, they didn't have a question. That wasn't an option, was it? They just simply couldn't keep up. There are other Confederates, though, who look at this retreating column that's dissolving, that's melting away, and they write letters home and say, if only, I'm going to quote one now, if these faint-hearted men, woo, that's tough stuff. Faint-hearted men, if they would only trust in God, all would go right. And we know the other thing that's driving these Confederate soldiers to stay in the ranks is none other than Robert E. Lee himself, right? That devotion was built upon battlefield success. They always thought somehow, some way, that R.E. Lee would do what he had always done in the past, that he would be able to pull victory out. That simply was not the case. That delay at Amelia Courthouse cost him, during the retreat, Union cavalry under Sheridan slashed at the Confederate column. They would dismount troopers who fired not the Springfield rifle that shot 3 times a minute, but they fired Spencer, which is essentially repeating rifles. They would lay down a heavy fire, lacerate the column, and of course you can imagine the disarray and the confusion. Sheridan even had some of his soldiers dress up as civilians and soldiers, Confederate soldiers, and he then sent them into the Confederate column to cause even more confusion. So everything's unraveling away. There is some interesting correspondence between Grant and Lee, and here's the thing I want you to think about. Should Lee be held morally accountable for not bringing this thing to an end? Was the loss of life, especially once you get past a battle called Sailor's Creek, which is on April the 2nd, 6th, in which he lost thousands of men, continuing that fight, was that an immoral decision? Many, of course, of his subordinates, they were mixed in what Lee should do. But on the evening of April the 8th, does that say, okay, there's Appomattox Courthouse, yes. On April the 8th, Lee is roughly in this area. He has a final council of war. One of his subordinates says, the game's up. You need to surrender. Lee brushed him aside. He said that too many men had given their lives for us to call it quits yet, that there was more fight in the army. Another officer came up to him and said, let's head to the bush. Let's engage what we would call guerrilla warfare. Of course, Lee would have none of that. He said he was too old for that, and he also understood that that would then engulf the South, and fighting for that would go on endlessly. What Lee then decided to do was that on April the 9th, he believed that at Appomattox Courthouse, and just a little bit to the west here, that there was only cavalry, just horsemen, and that they would be able, the Confederate infantry, to knock those horsemen away, brush them aside, and then continue that retreat with the hope of doing what? Getting south, getting south. They don't want to stop going west. And so they agreed that, in fact, if they only found horsemen, cavalry, that they would, again, continue the attack on April the 9th. Came, and of course, what was there? But Union infantry as well. And Union infantry that came there because Phil Sheridan drove them hard, drove his cavalry hard, and was able to loop around and to essentially box them in, but for all practical purposes, to box in the Confederate Army. So, and I apologize that so much I wanted to cover, and I'm not going to be able to, but we can do this in conversation. As you know, a few days after the surrender on April the 9th, and then there was a formal surrender on April the 12th at Appomattox, was then followed by Lincoln's assassination in Ford's Theater. There's a lot of speculation about about Booth's motivation. John Wilkes Booth, an actor. John Wilkes Booth often calls the crazed Booth, the lunatic Booth. I have all of you just think carefully about that, especially in the times that we live today. Think about the risk in which we see extreme violence in the form of political action, right? It's a form of trying to become a martyr, isn't it? And if we just dismiss it as this is the work of a lunatic, I think we miss a great deal. Because in the case of John Wilkes Booth, he had heard President Lincoln give a speech in March of 1865, and in that speech, I suspect some of you know what he promised. What did Lincoln promise? Black voting. That's where he was moving toward. Booth heard it, and I always use the words that historical figures use. I don't pretty them up for anyone. Booth said, that means nigger citizenship. I'm going to put one through him. Now, he never fought for the Confederate side. I think he felt ashamed and embarrassed by that. He certainly had a drinking problem. There's a host of things coming together. But what happened there when he walked into that presidential booth and put the Derringer right behind Abraham Lincoln's head and fired, and then jumped off the stage yelling "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which, as you probably know, is the motto of the state of Virginia. Of course, everyone was aghast and surprised and shocked, not really understanding what was happening until they heard Mary Lincoln shrieking until she then passed out herself. And then, as you know, Booth made his escape, and it's something that, if you like, we can talk about. This is what I want to end with here, and just, again, think about Abraham Lincoln and the fact that we hold up Lincoln as this man, this visionary, who spoke to the hearts and minds of Northern people, that he was able to capture the idealism of the Union cause, and he was able to bring in the promise of liberty, what this country ultimately wanted to aspire to become, and certainly time and time again he was able to do that. But let's not forget that Lincoln was a formidable politician, and let's not forget that Lincoln was brilliant in being able to manage the politics and the military reality of that war. And let us not forget, above all else, that in his last speech, or I should say his last inauguration, in January of 1865, Lincoln said, "And then the war came." And then the war came. He concluded with that point after speaking about how both Northerners and Southerners were complicit in the institution of slavery. Complicit in the institution of slavery. How about that for a bold, brave speech as an inaugural speech? He wasn't pointing fingers. He wasn't saying, "Look at us. We are God's chosen people." Instead, he said, "It's the inscrutable ways of God, and we can't figure it out. But we do know that we are somehow, some way, all responsible for this great crime." But then, we need to think about, for this great crime and this horrendous shedding of blood, this awful violence, was it worth it? And so I'll have you think about this, and I'll conclude with these two images. 1859, John Brown's raid, Harper's Ferry. Marine forces from Washington, D.C., led by R.E. Lee, they came, and they did what? But suppress that rebellion. This is the power of the federal government on display on behalf of what class of individuals? The Southern slave-holding class. Good? And here is Charleston, February 1865. I already mentioned to you. First troops coming in here. African-American troops singing John Brown's Body. Can you imagine any Betty man in 1859 who would have said, "There will come a day when you'll see former slaves and free blacks wearing the blue suit of the federal government, shouldering muskets, marching into Charleston, of all places, and singing John Brown's Body." And then this is the final image for you to think about. And it is the image of the South in the late 19th, but mostly early 20th century. It is the South of lynching. It is a South in which violence directed especially towards African American men, that it was absolutely unlimited. And so that we see this image, and here again is something we can puzzle about or think about as well. As horrible and as awful as this is, and time again, I will have students who will say, "Look, nothing changed. Nothing changed. You still have a white society bent on, determined to rule black people at any cost and to employ the most vile and awful means." But I'll have you all think about this. While these African Americans here and elsewhere were being lynched, were there African Americans being bought and sold and transported as property? Thank you very much. So I spoke for almost an hour, which I apologize. I wanted to try to speak for about 50 minutes. So I'm about 10 minutes over, and I know some of you have, I know I do. In about 2 hours, I'll be in bed. So I know that some of you have other things to do, but I would be more than happy to take comments, especially questions as well, whatever you might have. Yeah, go ahead. Yep. Yes, that's a very good point. I'm sorry that I should have said that. Certainly he couldn't have just done that on his own will, that he had Jefferson Davis that he had to have approval of, and who knows what conversations they had one-to-one or face-to-face. It's hard to imagine that Lee didn't put a little pressure on Jefferson Davis to vacate the city before it was too late. I think that Davis, who often is a scapegoat for Confederate defeat, and certainly he was not perfect, but when it came to this stage of the war, he was unwilling in any way to sort of see the reality of the military situation, and he certainly was, unlike Lee, prepared to resort to guerrilla warfare. I think the other interesting issue, again, is once the retreat started and once the army really started, Lee's army started to unravel, is that Lee keeps on fighting. Elizabeth Varyn has written a brilliant book about this. She makes an interesting case that what Lee was hoping for and why he kept prolonging this retreat is that he was hoping that he would be able to secure better terms for his army and for the Southern people as a whole. He was hoping for a restoration, which in fact many white Democrats in the North had actually called for as well. So that's what Lee was trying to angle for. What he didn't want, Lee, is what other Confederates that had met their demise before Grant, and that was, if you recall, unconditional surrender. Do you remember that? That's what Grant demanded of Confederate General Simon Buckner at Fort Donelson in 1862. Those words, and was more than what I think Lee could bear. So that's one reason why he was holding off. But you're talking about, for example, at Sailor's Creek, I mean, the Confederates suffered, I think it's something like 3,000 to 4,000 casualties. I mean, that's not child's play out there, right? It's pretty serious losses. Yeah. Yes, oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Professor, earlier on you mentioned Lincoln. As a historian, how do you look back on him today?
Yeah, I'm ashamed that even as a young person, you would think that that responsible historical thinking would have kicked in a little bit earlier for me. And now that I look at Lincoln, I was a damn Yankee and from Indiana. I mean, that's where Lincoln spent his formative years. I mean, we can attribute all of his greatness to that time in Indiana. I'm quite certain of that. It's certainly Lincoln was not flawless by any stretch of the imagination. I think there were times that his understandable desire to maintain a degree of unity in the North, which meant that he had to utilize political generals, Democrat and Republicans, who had virtually no military abilities, and the result of that were a lot of Northern men who I think died needlessly. That should not have happened. But for the cynics out there who say that the Emancipation Proclamation, for instance, is just simply a military measure, that is the most simplistic reading possible, and what it denies is what Jefferson Davis and what many other Confederates, how they read the Emancipation. Davis saw it as a document to inspire servile insurrection. So Lincoln is the master politician, which of course should be a compliment even today. It's annoying to hear people just say, oh, these politicians. Really? We live in a democracy. You want politicians who are skillful. You want politicians who understand how to create a public persona while working behind the scenes for what we would probably consider to be more noble goals. And that's what Lincoln did time and time again. And he ultimately did it with the greatest of humility. He was able to make jokes and laugh at himself. He never had to go in the room and say or prove that I'm the smartest person in this room, right? He's not Jefferson Davis. He's not dogmatic in that way at all. I had so much other good material I wanted to share with you, including his venture to City Point outside Petersburg in March of 1865, where he visited Grant, visited Sherman as well. There are interesting conversations that took place between them, but this is his sense of humility had even extended to his personal relationship with Mary Todd, who, let's be honest, she's an easy target. But unfortunately, the evidence about her is pretty overwhelming. And in March of '65, she came with Lincoln to visit the Army. She had many outbursts. She was just ridiculously jealous of anyone who was around the president, not just women. She said awful things to Grant's wife. She said to Grant's wife that, yes, all you can wait for now is for your husband to become president. She did all she could, Julia Grant did, to try to calm Mrs. Lincoln. She had many outbursts against him in public during this March period. She eventually left Petersburg, got back on a boat to go back up to Washington, D.C. The president stayed a little bit longer. And that's when I had a slide of that he actually came into the city of Richmond, which was this incredible moment, right? Can you believe this? All that this guy had endured, how he had gotten knocked around by both sides, and here is that moment, the capital of the Confederacy, and he actually gets to sit where? In Jefferson Davis's desk. Although the descriptions of again, here's Lincoln. You know, if I had been Abraham Lincoln, I'll be honest with you, I'd have been dancing on the desk, right? But no, not Lincoln, right? He sits there, he's forlorn. I mean, he had seen so much. Even at Petersburg, there's an attack at a place called Fort Stedman. And he called it a little rumpus. It wasn't a little rumpus. There was about 4,000 casualties on the Confederate side. But it was close to City Point. And he said to Grant, I want to go see the field. And Grant finally relented, and they came, and they saw all the casualties. He saw all these Confederate prisoners. And according to one account, the president wept. He cried when he saw what this war was doing to both sides. And you know, that again is what's so amazing is that second inaugural. I like it better than the Gettysburg Address, actually. I like the idea of complicity, right? I like the idea that he says, it reminds me of the line in the movie Glory when Matthew Broderick and, oh my gosh, Denzel Washington, that's right. They have this great meeting, right? They're talking, and Denzel Washington says, I don't want to carry your flag. I want to do it. And Matthew Broderick, or Robert Gulshaw, says, we're all dirty. We're all dirty in this. Not so sure how the slaves are dirty in this, but he said we're all dirty in this. And that's a really kind of powerful point, and Lincoln articulated it with such beauty. Okay. Oh, yes, we got one over here. Wait, one all over the side there.
You might have alluded to this earlier in your presentation, but I didn't catch it because I have bad hearing. Anyway, my wife and I were in Gettysburg a couple weeks ago, and we always marvel at military strategy. Why in 1863 were there a line of 15 that just stood up and took the bullets? They'd fall, another line. Didn't the guys at West Point learn anything about military strategy?
So this is a great question. I can answer it very efficiently because I know, again, we're running out of time here. So I mentioned to you before the weaponry they used, only fire 3 times a minute to be effective on the battlefield. And we're just going to take these 2 rows right here, right? This is how you would line up. Linear formations, you'd be shoulder to shoulder. You don't have to move. You have pretend comrades here, all right? Yeah. Shoulder, 2 ranks deep, and they would move in these linear formations. They, of course, presented themselves as great targets, yes? But they also, of course, could unleash tremendous firepower. Good? All right. Now, you can't get around this. There's no other alternative. You want to disperse all these people? You've done just that. You've then dispersed all your firepower. So it's something to some degree called technology and tactics. They're really not in alignment here. But what you have to remember is that frontal assaults in the Civil War, though lethal, were not predetermined to failure. They didn't always result in hideous losses without some kind of gain or advantage. Pickett and Pettigrew's charge is a great example. Everyone looks at the field today and they say, how could Lee, after all these brilliant victories, a man who relied on maneuver, how could he do this? Well, there's lots of things that could complicate your understanding of Pickett and Pettigrew's charge. I won't give them to you now. I will give them to your students tomorrow. Sorry, we just don't have the time for that, but I can say this. Did not Pickett and Pettigrew's men break the Union line? They did. Problem with Pickett and Pettigrew's charge, there just weren't enough men. Lee didn't commit enough. That's kind of the irony of it, right? A man who was known for his audacity, he put all in, didn't he? Double down. He didn't do it on July 3rd. Longstreet, it's Longstreet's fault. I really believe that. I mean, if you have to start pointing fingers, but I don't like that kind of game. It's silly. What we should remind ourselves of is like in World War I, there's that idea that it's lions led by donkeys. That's just not true. I mean, they made adjustments. I mean, these guys are smart. They care about their men. And it's the same thing that happened in the Civil War. So they make the adjustments, but there's just some things you can't get around, and we can't overlook the fact that frontal attacks work. This is a little-known fact. Cold Harbor, which everyone imagines like 5,000 men just getting shot down in 15 minutes, which of course did not happen. The Union forces on one part of the attack actually broke the Confederate line. They broke the line. So that stereotype of Civil War officers hurling their men forward like the butcher Grant, I understand why people reach that conclusion, especially when you go to a battlefield, but they actually were as innovative as they possibly could have been under those circumstances with the weaponry they used, and were successful many times in using frontal assaults. I thought we had one other hand here right now. Oh, one more question? What do you think? How are we doing here? One more?
This goes back to the start of the war. Do you think Lincoln made a mistake by calling for the 75,000 volunteers a few days before the Virginia legislature voted for secession?
So the issue is that when Lincoln called for those troops, that it was, and that's a very good point, that it was not the firing on Fort Sumter, it was the calling for the troops that enraged the moderates in Virginia. And did Lincoln make a mistake in doing that? I don't think he had any other option. With the firing on Fort Sumter, he has southern states that are part of a confederacy, not recognized as the Confederacy, but they are states in a rebellion. He has to now suppress that rebellion, and I don't see any other way around that. So here again is something for you all to think about, is that one might argue the events leading up to secession, that it was a consequence of blundering politicians. These were politicians that were so concerned about partisan issues, and they employed rhetoric that was incredibly irresponsible. That rhetoric, for example, the black Republicans, Southerners leveled that time and time again. Black Republicans meant what? Abolitionists? Were most white Northerners abolitionists? No, they despised them, didn't they? The white Northerners referred to Southerners as the slave power. Was there a slave power at work in the South? Well, to some degree, but it wasn't quite as dark and as maniacal as they portrayed it. And so my point being is this, especially as we run into an election year. And I never, ever reveal my political hand or my partisanship ever with my students. I always like to keep them guessing. But I will say this. There is a responsibility to rhetoric. There is a responsibility to at least try to get some of the facts right. And we should remind ourselves that when we laugh at some things that are so utterly absurd, so absolutely disconnected from what we know is true, and we think, yeah, we could just dismiss that. There were a lot of moderates, North and South, when secession came, said, damn it, Lee one of them. I hate those fire eaters, and I hate those abolitionists, and they got us into this mess. And we had partisan politics that basically what? They were accomplices. That's one argument about it, but I will ask you again as we think about that image, and we think about the cost and the price of this war, and you might look at this again, it's so hideous, and we think about it, all those casualties. I think somehow, some way this had to be avoided. My God, fighting ourselves, and in a political system that should have been able to manage these differences, somehow, some way, they could have found a compromise. That feels all pretty good, doesn't it? But if you think that way, for a moment, you have to put yourself in the position of what? Of a slave, of an African American. Because you might say, hey, compromise is the right way to go. Let's just push this thing back. Let's kick the can. And there's where Lincoln's a genius. And I love Lincoln for this. He decided he wasn't going to be a politician. He said, I'm going to take a stand here. You can keep your slaves. The Constitution protects it, but you're not taking them into the territories, and we're done. We're drawing the line in the sand here. And here again, Americans want statesmen. They don't want politicians. But poor old Abe, when he's a statesman, everyone says, look what he did. He just started war here. Well, what he did is he said, no more. And I suspect for a lot of slaves and a lot of African Americans, they said, what? Thank God. Thank God. And let, of course, God's wrath unleash itself on this nation so that we can what? So that we can be free. Good? Hey, let me say one more time, Dr. Smith, what a pleasure it has been to get to know you. And let me just say one other thing. Joe Glatar, if you want to read a great book on the Civil War, it is Joe Glatar. I read Joe Glatar's book when I was in college. I'm good friends with Joe Glatar now. And you know what? There wouldn't be a Joe Glatar if there wasn't you. So thank you so much for your time. All right?
Thank you so much.